The first thing I noticed when consciousness slowly crawled back into my body was warmth. Deep, steady warmth beneath my cheek. The kind that felt strangely solid and reassuring. For a few quiet seconds, my tired mind assumed I was still lying in my hotel bed after the exhausting charity opening event from the night before. But the moment my senses sharpened and the distant hum of an airplane engine reached my ears, realization began creeping in like cold water pouring down my spine. I was not in my bed. I was on a plane and my head was resting on something that was definitely not a pillow. Slowly, very slowly, I lifted my heavy eyelids, the dull ache in my skull, reminding me that I had absolutely drunk more champagne than my body could handle the previous night. As the private jet's pale morning light spilled through the windows, I finally understood the horrifying truth about my current position. My cheek was resting on someone's shoulders. For a brief moment, I wondered if this was still part of a drunken dream, because no sane alpha wakes up draped across another man like an exhausted house cat. But the scent that filled my lungs shattered that hopeful thought instantly. A cool, deep, commanding pheromone signature so powerful and distinct that every instinct inside my alpha body immediately stiffened. Enigma pheromones. My heart stuttered. There were only a handful of enigmas in the global business world, and unfortunately for me, I knew exactly whose scent this was. Very slowly, like someone approaching a loaded weapon, I lifted my head and there he was. Dominic Ashford, the famous Enigma CEO, the man who could make entire boardrooms fall silent just by entering them. The founder of Ashford Global Holdings, one of the most powerful companies in the international market. The cold, untouchable Enigma whose intimidating aura had been the subject of whispered stories across corporate circles for years. And apparently, I had been using his shoulder as a pillow for God knows how long. My brain shut down completely. I jerked upright so quickly that my shoulder nearly slammed into the seat in front of me. My pulse raced as embarrassment burned across my entire face, and before my pride could stop me, my mouth was already moving. "Sorry," I blurred. The word echoed louder than I expected inside the quiet cabin of the private jet. Dominic Ashford did not move. He did not flinch. He did not even blink. Instead, he simply watched me with those sharp eyes of his, the kind of eyes that looked like they could dissect a person's entire personality in less than 3 seconds. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the fog in my head. But unfortunately, that only reminded me of the pounding headache left behind by last night's event, where investors, journalists, and social elites had insisted on celebrating the opening of my newest technology branch until nearly 3 in the morning. I remembered the endless toast, the flashing cameras, the champagne glasses that never seemed to stay empty. What I did not remember was falling asleep on Dominic Ashford's shoulders, which I did on our way to the most important business meeting of my life. His voice finally broke the silence. "You drool when you sleep." I froze. My entire soul left my body. Without thinking, I wiped the corner of my mouth so quickly that I nearly smacked myself in the face. I didn't mean to. "You also talk." My stomach dropped. That was worse. Much worse. I stared at him cautiously. What did I say? Dominic tilted his head slightly, the early sunlight reflecting faintly against his dark hair. And for a moment he looked like some dangerously beautiful statue, carved out of calm confidence and quiet power. "You complained about investors," he said evenly. My eyes widened. "You called someone a vampire in a suit." I buried my face in my hands, and then he continued calmly. "You asked if someone could bring you noodles." A long, painful silence filled the cabin. I could feel the humiliation burning straight through my bones. This was the worst business trip of my entire career. I slowly lowered my hands and forced myself to breathe, though the embarrassment still clung to my chest like a heavy weight. "I'm really sorry," I said quietly. Dominic studied me for a moment, his expression still unreadable, before finally shifting his posture slightly. That was when I noticed something even more shocking. He had not moved, not once. His suit was still perfectly arranged. His posture was relaxed but steady, which meant he had allowed me to sleep on his shoulder for hours. The realization made my ears burn. "Why didn't you wake me up?" I asked. Dominic leaned back slightly in his seat. "You were tired." His tone was simple, matter of fact, like it was the most normal thing in the world. His gaze rested on me again. "When you first fell asleep," he said calmly, "your shoulders were tense. I didn't know what to say." Dominic Ashford, the cold enigma that terrified half the corporate world, had apparently spent an entire flight observing my sleeping posture. And somehow that fact was even more unsettling. The private jet hummed quietly as the pilot announced our upcoming descent into Geneva, where a 3-day-long international economic conference would be held. a conference that both our companies had been invited to. Normally, our schedules were carefully arranged to avoid overlapping meetings. Keros Ventures and Ashford Global were competitors after all. Not enemies, but rivals. The kind of rivals that prefer distance. Yet somehow fate had shoved us onto the same flight. I exhaled slowly, still trying to recover my dignity. "Thank you for not pushing me off," I said. Dominic's lips moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "You looked comfortable." My heart skipped. I quickly looked out the window before he could see the color rising to my face. Because the last thing I expected on this trip was discovering that the most feared enigma in the corporate world had apparently become my accidental pillow. By the time our plane finally landed in Geneva, my dignity had only partially recovered from the humiliating discovery that I had spent an unknown number of hours sleeping on Dominic Ashford's shoulder like a drunk college student who missed his bed. Although Dominic himself seemed completely unbothered by the incident, I, on the other hand, had spent the entire time staring out the window while replaying the moment in my head like a cursed memory that refused to leave. The moment we stepped off the jet, the crisp air hit my face, cool and sharp, instantly clearing the last fragments of alcohol lingering in my system. For a brief second, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps the rest of the days would proceed normally. That Dominic Ashford and I would simply go our separate ways once we reached the conference venue, attending different meetings and speaking to different investors the way rival CEOs usually did. Unfortunately, reality had other plans. The moment we entered the arrival hall, I saw exactly what kind of presence Dominic Ashford carried in the corporate world. People noticed him. The moment he walked through the terminal, conversations paused, heads turned, and the quiet murmur of recognition spread through the crowd like ripples across still water. Even seasoned executives, people who regularly negotiated billion-dollar deals, straightened their posture the moment they spotted him, their expressions shifting into that careful blend of respect and caution that people usually reserve for individuals far more dangerous than ordinary businessmen. I walked beside him silently, pretending not to notice the reactions around us. Though internally, I couldn't help studying the phenomenon unfolding before my eyes. Dominic Ashford didn't acknowledge any of it. He simply walked forward with calm, measured steps, one hand tucked casually into the pocket of his coat. His posture relaxed, but commanding in a way that made it seem as though the entire building naturally arranged itself around him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly composed. Even without the unmistakable weight of Enigma pheromones surrounding him like an invisible crown, he would have been impossible to ignore. But the pheromones were there, subtle and controlled, a deep scent that carried the quiet promise of overwhelming dominance if he ever chose to release it fully. I had heard rumors about enigmas my entire career, though encountering one up close was rare enough that most people in the business world treated them almost like myths, stronger than alphas. In fact, they were the only ones who could humble alphas, so we dreaded them. They are more instinct-driven, dangerously charismatic, and according to some stories, frighteningly possessive when their instincts were triggered. Dominic Ashford embodied every one of those rumors. We reached the luxury hotel hosting the International Economic Conference shortly after noon, and the lobby was already buzzing with activity as corporate leaders from around the world checked in. Their assistants juggling phones, tablets, and schedules while security staff quietly monitored the growing crowd of influential guests. The moment Dominic stepped through the revolving doors, the atmosphere shifted again. Several conversations stopped mid-sentence. A pair of executives standing near the reception desk lowered their voices. One man who had been laughing loudly a moment earlier suddenly adjusted his tie like a nervous student preparing for a presentation. And then the whispers began again. "That's him, the Ashford Enigma. I heard he destroyed an entire corporation last year. He bought them out overnight." I kept my expression neutral, though internally I felt an odd mixture of fascination and disbelief as I listened to the rumors float through the air. Corporate takeovers were brutal sometimes, yes, but the way people spoke about Dominic made it sound less like business strategy and more like a battlefield legend. Dominic himself ignored every word. He approached the reception desk calmly, spoke quietly with the hotel manager, and accepted his room key without the slightest hint that half the lobby had just spent 5 minutes discussing him like some mythical predator. I stepped forward to check in as well, hoping the process would move quickly so I could escape to my room and mentally recover from the strange events of the morning. But just as the receptionist handed me my key card, a voice behind me spoke. "Mr. Kai," I turned. Dominic Ashford was looking directly at me. Those sharp eyes of his seemed almost unnaturally perceptive, like they noticed details most people missed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked calmly, "Hope you don't feel less comfortable here." I nearly choked. A nearby executive who had been pretending not to eavesdrop suddenly looked extremely interested in the hotel carpet. "Yes, I enjoy it here," I answered carefully. Dominic nodded once, as if confirming some private observation. "That's good." And then just like that, he turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving behind a small cloud of stunned silence in the lobby. The executive beside me leaned closer. "You know him?" I hesitated. "Not really." The man gave me a skeptical look. "He just asked if you were comfortable." I forced a polite smile. "It's a long story." An hour later, I found myself standing inside the main conference hall, reviewing presentation notes for the panel discussion I was scheduled to participate in later that afternoon. I was halfway through rereading a financial projection when the room suddenly grew quieter. I didn't even need to look up to know what had happened. Dominic had entered the hall, still curiosity won. My gaze lifted, and there he was, standing near the far side of the room, speaking with a group of investors, who looked both eager and cautious at the same time. Dominic listened more than he spoke. His posture relaxed, his expression neutral. But the moment he offered an opinion about a market trend, every person around him immediately paid attention with almost unnatural focus. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked up. Our eyes met across the crowded conference hall. For a brief moment, the rest of the room faded into background noise. One of the investors beside him asked a question. Dominic answered, but his eyes never left mine. If there was one thing I had decided after the events of the morning, and the increasingly uncomfortable realization that Dominic Ashford seemed to notice my existence far more than I was prepared for, it was that the safest course of action during this conference would be simple: maintain distance, attend my meetings, avoid unnecessary interactions, and absolutely never place myself in situations where I might accidentally fall asleep on the shoulder of the most intimidating enigma in the corporate world ever again. Approximately 6 hours after my plan, the problem began after the afternoon panel discussion finally ended. My brain was buzzing with economic forecasts, investor negotiations, and an alarming number of sideways glances from curious executives who had apparently already heard the rumor that Dominic Ashford had spoken to me in the hotel lobby earlier. I was exhausted. All I wanted was to return to my hotel room, remove my suit, and spend at least 20 quiet minutes staring at the ceiling while pretending the business world did not exist. So I walked into the lobby, pressed the elevator button, and waited. The doors opened with a soft chime, and inside the elevator stood Dominic Ashford. For a brief moment I considered turning around and pretending I had suddenly remembered an urgent meeting somewhere else. But unfortunately, Dominic had already noticed me. His eyes lifted slightly. "Kai." My name sounded different in his voice. I stepped inside before my brain could betray me. "Dominic." The elevator doors closed behind me with a quiet metallic slide that suddenly felt much louder than necessary. There were only 2 of us inside, which meant there was absolutely nowhere for my attention to go, except the very tall, very composed Enigma standing beside me. So, naturally, I decided to stare at the elevator buttons instead. Floor numbers had never looked so fascinating. The elevator began moving upwards smoothly, the quiet hum of machinery filling the small enclosed space, and for several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could feel his presence beside me, though not physically touching, but close enough that the faint trace of his scent lingered in the air. My instincts reacted immediately. Alphas were supposed to be confident around other dominant types, but Enigmas were different. And being this close to one felt like standing beside a quiet storm that could erupt at any moment, which was probably why I made the mistake of glancing sideways. Just a quick glance, but Dominic was already looking at me. I snapped my eyes forward instantly. 5 seconds passed. I glanced again. He was still looking. I looked away again. This repeated 3 more times before Dominic finally spoke. "Are you expecting the numbers to change?" My brain stalled. "What is it?" His gaze flicked toward the elevator panel. "You've checked the floor indicator 4 times in the last 20 seconds. Heat rushed into my face. 10 seconds later, I accidentally glanced at him again. He caught me again. This time, he raised one eyebrow slightly. I turned back toward the elevator doors so quickly that my neck almost protested. Why was I behaving like a teenager with a crush? This was ridiculous. I was a respected businessman. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat. And yet somehow standing inside an elevator with Dominic Ashford had reduced me to the social grace of an awkward intern. The elevator suddenly jerked hard. The lights flickered, and before my brain could process what was happening, the entire elevator stopped moving. I lost my balance instantly. My foot slipped slightly against the polished floor, my body tilting sideways as the sudden stop threw my center of gravity off. For one embarrassing half-second, I genuinely believed I was about to crash into the elevator wall like a clumsy cartoon character. Then Dominic's hand caught my waist. He had stepped closer automatically. One arm wrapped around my waist to steady me, while the other braced lightly against the elevator wall behind me. My breath caught. For a moment, we were standing far closer than two rival CEOs probably should. My heart started doing very suspicious things inside my chest. "Are you all right?" Dominic asked. Calmly, his voice was low. "Yes," I said quickly. Though, judging by the heat rising to my face, my body clearly disagreed with that statement. Dominic didn't move immediately. His hand was still resting against my waist, steady and secure. His fingers curved slightly, like he was making absolutely certain I wouldn't lose my balance again, which was thoughtful, but also extremely distracting. My brain had suddenly forgotten how breathing worked properly. "You can let go now," I managed to say. Dominic looked down. His gaze briefly followed the line of his arm. Then he released me slowly. I immediately took half a step backward, mostly so my heart could attempt to regain its normal rhythm. The elevator lights flickered again. Somewhere above us, machinery hummed uncertainly. Then a quiet mechanical voice crackled through the speaker. "Please remain calm. The elevator will resume operation shortly." Great. We were trapped inside a small enclosed space with pheromones. My alpha instincts were extremely aware of the Enigma standing less than 2 feet away from me. And now that we had stopped moving, the scent of Dominic's pheromones seemed slightly stronger, still controlled, but noticeable. And apparently my own scent had decided to respond. Wonderful. Dominic's gaze shifted toward me again. "You're releasing pheromones. I nearly died. I am not." "You are." I crossed my arms defensively. "It's probably the ventilation." Dominic tilted his head slightly. "It smells like honey." My ears turned red instantly. Most alphas had sharp pheromone signatures: spice, smoke, musk. Mine had always been embarrassingly soft, which was not exactly intimidating in the alpha hierarchy. Dominic studied me quietly for a moment longer. Then he said something that made my brain short-circuit. "It's pleasant." I blinked. "What? Your scent?" He leaned back slightly against the elevator wall, his posture relaxed. "It's calming," he said again. I stared at him. This was the same man executives described as a corporate predator, the same Enigma who had reportedly dismantled entire companies without hesitation. And he was currently standing in a broken elevator complimenting my pheromones. "You're joking," I said weakly. Dominic shook his head. "I rarely joke." The elevator finally jolted back to life. The lights steadied. The machinery resumed its smooth hum. Neither of us moved for a second. Then the doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped forward quickly, eager to escape before my brain completely melted from the strange tension that had filled the elevator during those few minutes. But just as I crossed the threshold into the hallway, Dominic spoke again. "Kai." I turned back immediately. Dominic was still standing inside the elevator. His eyes rested on me with that same quiet intensity one had noticed earlier in the conference hall. Then he said calmly, "You look at me every minute." My face immediately betrayed me. "I do not, you do." The elevator doors began sliding closed, and just before they shut completely, Dominic added one final sentence. "Next time you can look longer." Then the doors closed, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with a racing heartbeat and the sudden terrifying realization that the most feared Enigma in the corporate world was flirting with me. After the elevator incident, I made a very serious decision. Avoid Dominic Ashford completely, which meant I spent the rest of the afternoon behaving like a suspiciously alert squirrel every time I entered a hallway, checking corners before turning to them and strategically choosing conference rooms that were far away from wherever the most powerful Enigma in the building might possibly be standing. This plan worked beautifully until dinner. The hotel restaurant was elegant in that quiet, expensive way that made every clink of silverware sound important, with soft golden lighting reflecting across polished glass tables, while business leaders from around the world held low conversations about markets, investments, and strategies that could change entire industries. I chose a small table near the window, not too close to the crowd, not too isolated either, just peaceful enough for me to enjoy my food without worrying about unexpected corporate predators appearing beside me. I ordered grilled salmon, a glass of wine, and 5 full minutes of uninterrupted silence. Then a chair moved. I looked up. Dominic Ashford was pulling out the seat across from me. My brain immediately forgot how to behave normally. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked calmly. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. "No," I said quickly. Dominic sat down. Just like that, like it was the most natural thing in the world for rival CEOs to share dinner, after getting trapped in an elevator together earlier that day. The waiter returned to take his order. And while Dominic spoke in that calm, steady voice of his, I made the mistake of studying him again. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Tall, composed, perfect posture, sharp gray eyes that somehow managed to look both cool and attentive at the same time. When the waiter finally left, Dominic's gaze shifted back to me. "You've been avoiding me," he said. I nearly dropped my fork. "I have not. You turned around in the hallway earlier. I forgot something." I lied again. Dominic's lips curved slightly. It wasn't a full smile, but it was enough to make my heart perform several suspicious acrobatics inside my chest. Dinner arrived a few minutes later, and for a brief moment I believed I could survive this interaction with my dignity intact. That hope lasted exactly 10 seconds. "So," Dominic said calmly while cutting his steak, "how did you build Cost Ventures?" Simple question, normal conversation. Unfortunately, Dominic chose that exact moment to look directly at me while asking it. My brain malfunctioned. "Well, I started with a small tech partnership, and then expanded the software branch, which attracted early investors, and then my fork slipped. A piece of salmon nearly escaped the plate. I caught it at the last second. Very graceful, very professional." Dominic watched this entire performance silently. I cleared my throat. "Anyway," I continued, pretending nothing had happened. "Growth happened quickly." Dominic nodded thoughtfully. "You built $1 million company before 30. That sounds less impressive when you say it like that." "How should I say it?" Before I could answer, I took another bite of food. Unfortunately, my coordination was still recovering from Dominic's direct eye contact. A small grain of rice apparently decided to betray me. I didn't notice it. Dominic did. Before I could react, he reached across the table, calmly, lifting his napkin. Then he leaned forward slightly and gently brushed the grain of rice from the corner of my mouth. My brain stopped working. The gesture was simple, but the warmth of his hand being that close to my face sent a wave of pure embarrassment straight through my body. I froze. Dominic pulled the napkin back. "There was rice on your face," he said simply. "I see that," I replied faintly. My ears were burning. I was suddenly extremely aware that the most feared enigma in the corporate world had just cleaned my face like I was a distracted child. Dominic continued eating calmly, like nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, I spent the next 30 seconds trying to remember how chewing worked. "You're clumsy tonight," he observed. "I am not clumsy." Dominic looked amused again, and this time the small smile actually reached his eyes. Then he said something softer. "You're different from other alphas." I blinked. "What do you mean?" I asked calmly. "They try to impress me, and I don't." "You try to survive dinner?" he said calmly. I sighed. "That's because you're Dominic Ashford," and he retorted. "And everyone knows you're terrifying." Dominic leaned back slightly. His gaze rested on me with that same quiet focus that made my chest tighten every time. "I don't find you afraid?" I hesitated. "Maybe not afraid." "Then what?" I looked down at my plate, trying very hard to find a safe answer. "I'm being careful," I admitted. For a moment, Dominic didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "You don't need to be." My heart stumbled, and for the rest of dinner, I couldn't decide what was more dangerous. Dominic Ashford's reputation, or the way he kept looking at me, like I was the most interesting person in the room. Dinner with Dominic Ashford ended far more peacefully than it had begun, which in itself was already a small miracle, considering the number of times I had nearly embarrassed myself during the meal. And although Dominic had remained calm and composed the entire time, occasionally watching my clumsy attempts at elegance with that quiet, almost amused expression of his, the strange warmth of the conversation lingered in my mind even after he stood to leave. "I have a meeting with investors," Dominic said as he adjusted his coat. Of course he did. Dominic Ashford probably scheduled meetings the way ordinary people scheduled coffee breaks. I nodded. His eyes rested on me for a moment longer than necessary. "Try not to launch any more food across the table," he said, with a subtle smirk on his face. And without another word, he turned and walked toward a table near the center of the restaurant, where several well-dressed investors were already waiting for him. I exhaled quietly once he was gone. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, sitting across from Dominic Ashford had become strangely overwhelming. Not unpleasant, just intense. So, I leaned back in my chair, finishing the last sip of my drink while allowing myself a moment to relax in the soft glow of the restaurant lights. Shortly after I was done, that was when someone spoke beside me. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up. Standing beside the table was another man, tall, confident, clearly an alpha. Judging by the sharpness of his pheromones and judging by the easy smile on his face, he was far more relaxed than most executives attending this conference. "Sure," I said politely. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "James Corner," he introduced, extending a hand. "Kai?" He shook my hand firmly before leaning back in his seat, studying me with open curiosity. "You're the CEO of Kairos Ventures, right?" "That's me." James nodded slowly. "I saw you earlier during the panel discussion. That means you also saw me trying not to trip over the microphone cable." He laughed. "I thought that was impressive multitasking," he said. His laugh was warm, the kind of laugh that made conversations feel natural instead of carefully measured. Then his gaze lingered on my face for a moment longer before he said something that completely caught me off guard. "You're really an alpha?" "I bless, of course." James tilted his head slightly. "Interesting," he said. "Why do you ask?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Because you look beautiful enough to be an Omega." I stared at him. Then I laughed, not a polite chuckle. The real laugh, the kind that escaped unexpectedly before I could stop it. "Well," I said once I managed to breathe again, "that's a new one." "I mean it," James continued casually. "If someone told me you were an Omega, I'd believe them instantly." "That's probably not a compliment in alpha circles," I replied back. "Oh, it's definitely a compliment." He grinned. "And honestly, if you were an Omega, I wouldn't hesitate to make you my mate." I nearly choked. That escalated quickly. James laughed again. "Too direct." "Very. But you laughed." "That's because you're ridiculous." Across the restaurant, Dominic Ashford sat with his group of investors. Though at that moment, the discussion about international markets had clearly lost his attention because his gaze was fixed directly on our table. The investors continued talking, presenting charts and projections, but Dominic barely glanced at them. Instead, his eyes remained on the alpha sitting across from me on James. Meanwhile, I was still smiling. "You're really funny," I admitted. "Thank you. I work hard on my material." "Is that your strategy at business conferences?" "Flirt and tell jokes only when I see someone worth talking to." I laughed again, which was apparently the exact moment Dominic Ashford decided he had heard enough. Across the room, he suddenly stood. The investors looked confused, but Dominic was already walking toward our table. James noticed him first. The shift in atmosphere was immediate, because when Dominic Ashford approached, the calm confidence James had shown moments earlier disappeared almost instantly. Dominic stopped beside our table, tall and impossibly composed. James stood up so quickly, his chair nearly scraped the floor. "Mr. Ashford," he said stiffly. Dominic simply looked at him. That was all. No raised voice, no threatening posture, just a quiet, unreadable stare, and somehow that was enough. James cleared his throat. "I'll say hello another time." He gave me a quick nod before walking away with suspicious speed, disappearing into the crowd of guests near the bar. The laughter that had filled my chest moments earlier faded quickly as the quiet tension Dominic brought with him settled over the table. I looked up at him. Dominic looked down at me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Dominic finally said, "I've never seen you laugh like that." I blinked. "Well, there's actually a soft and beautiful side of me." His eyebrow lifted slightly. "I see the side that likes listening to jokes." Dominic's considered that quietly. Then his voice lowered slightly. "If that's the case," he said calmly, "should I be your comedian for the night?" My brain stopped. "I could try," he continued, "if it makes you laugh more often." My face grew warm instantly, and for the first time that evening, I suddenly couldn't look Dominic Ashford in the eyes anymore. That night, Geneva was swallowed by rain. Thunder rolling across the sky like distant drums, while sharp streaks of lightning briefly illuminated the dark lake outside the hotel. I had planned to sleep early. Unfortunately, my mind refused to cooperate, because every time I closed my eyes, two things replayed themselves in my head. First, James Corner calling me beautiful like an Omega. Second, Dominic Ashford offering to become my personal comedian, which for reasons I still didn't fully understand was significantly more dangerous. So instead of sleeping, I found myself sitting alone in the quiet hotel lounge near midnight, my laptop open in front of me while spreadsheets and financial reports filled the screen. Work was supposed to calm my thoughts. Instead, I kept staring at the same line of numbers for 5 minutes straight, without processing a single one of them. Outside, thunder cracked again. I sighed and leaned back in my chair. "Can't sleep," I nearly jumped. Dominic Ashford stood a few steps away from the table, one hand resting casually in the pocket of his coat as if appearing in quiet rooms late at night was simply one of his many talents. "You walk very quietly," I said. "You were distracted." "That too." Dominic glanced at the laptop screen before sitting down across from me without asking. "You're working." "I'm trying. My brain is busy." "With what?" I hesitated. Then I said honestly, "You." Dominic didn't react dramatically, but his eyes softened slightly. "I see." Thunder rolled again outside the tall lounge windows, and for a moment, both of us turned our attention toward the storm beyond the glass. The rain fell heavily across the city lights. "I like storms," Dominic said quietly. "You do. They make everything else quiet." I considered that. He wasn't wrong. The hotel lounge, which had been busy earlier in the evening, was now nearly empty as most guests had retreated to their rooms. Only the distant sound of rain filled the space. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room for a moment, before fading again into soft golden lamplight. We sat in comfortable silence for a while after that. Then something strange happened. My hand moved slightly across the table while reaching for my glass. At the exact same moment, Dominic's hand shifted as well. Our fingers touched just lightly, but neither of us pulled away immediately. His hand was warm. The contact lasted only a few seconds before I cleared my throat and reached for my drink, but the warmth lingered. Dominic's gaze remained on me. "You're very calm for an alpha," he said quietly. "That's not usually considered a compliment." "It is to me," I frowned slightly. Dominic leaned forward a little, resting his arms on the table. Then he said something that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "Your scent calms my instincts." I blinked. "You're an enigma. Aren't enigmas supposed to terrify everyone?" "Usually, but not tonight." Dominic looked at me for a long moment. Then he said softly, "Not when I'm with you." The rain outside continued falling. Thunder rolled across the distant sky again. But inside the quiet lounge, something warm and unfamiliar settled gently between us, like the beginning of a feeling. Neither of us was ready to name yet. The rain had finally stopped, but the night still carried its chill. I stepped outside the resort building, the cold air brushing against my skin as I walked slowly along the garden path. The storm had left everything wet. The stone pavement glistened under the soft golden lights, and droplets of water continued to fall from the leaves above. I sighed softly and rubbed my arms. The cold was beginning to seep through my clothes when a familiar voice suddenly came from behind me. "Couldn't sleep." I turned and saw Dominic walking toward me. Even in the dim light, he still looked composed, like the storm hadn't affected him at all. His hair was slightly damp, and his calm gaze settled on me in a way that made my heart skip a little. "Something like that," I replied. He walked beside me, and the two of us began strolling along the quiet path. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was strangely comfortable. Then Dominic suddenly stopped. I turned back to look at him, confused. Before I could ask what was wrong, he removed his coat and stepped closer, and then he placed it over my shoulders. I blinked in surprise. "You're cold," he said simply. Only then did I realize I had been shivering. The coat was warm, and it carried a faint scent that made me feel oddly calm. "You didn't have to do that," I said. Dominic slipped his hands back into his pockets as if it were nothing. I'd rather not have my business partner freezing during a work trip. I couldn't help but chuckle a little. We continued walking. The garden was quiet except for the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. Then Dominic spoke again. "You know, we've talked a lot about business." I glanced at him. "But I know almost nothing about your life outside of it," he continued. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you want to know?" He looked ahead as we walked. "Everything that made you who you are." I was silent for a moment, then I exhaled slowly. "Well, I wasn't born with a silver spoon." Dominic turned his head slightly, listening. "My parents worked incredibly hard," I continued. "We weren't rich, but they did everything they could to give me opportunities." A small smile appeared on my lips as memories surfaced. They fought tooth and nail for me. We passed under another lamp, its light reflecting on the wet ground. "After graduation," I said, "finding a job was really difficult. I went from company to company and kept getting rejected." Dominic didn't interrupt. "My dad would walk with me sometimes," I continued, "and there were moments when he even begged people to give me a chance." Back then, I had felt embarrassed. But now I understood how much love that must have taken. "Months after I finally got a good-paying job," I said softly, "my dad suddenly fell ill." The words felt heavier as they left my mouth, and I lost him. The night became quiet again. I stared at the wet path ahead of us, my chest tightening slightly, but Dominic's voice cut through my thoughts. "Don't look so down." I turned to him. His expression was calm, but his words carried certainty. "If anything," he said, He must be incredibly proud of you. I blinked. You built everything you have today from the ground up, Dominic continued. Not many people can say that. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Then I nodded slowly. My mom is doing well though, I said after a while. She lives comfortably now. My expression softened. I try to visit her whenever I can, even with my crazy schedule. Dominic nodded thoughtfully. Then he said something that made me stop walking entirely. I'd like to meet her someday. I froze. My mind went completely blank. I slowly turned to look at him. If you'd permit it. My heart skipped. Those simple words meant something far bigger than they sounded. It meant he wasn't treating this like a temporary acquaintance. He actually wanted to stay connected to my life. Even after this business trip ended, I quickly looked away, suddenly aware of how warm my face felt despite the cold night. But judging by the faint, amused look on Dominic's face, he had already noticed, and somehow that only made me feel even more shy as we continued walking under the quiet glow of the garden lights. The rumor started the moment we returned. Not the quiet kind of rumor that fades away after a few whispers, but the loud, dangerous kind that spreads through a room full of businessmen like fire touching dry grass. I noticed it the moment Dominic and I stepped into the conference hall the next morning. People were looking at me. Some were whispering behind glasses of champagne, others pretending to scroll through their phones while clearly listening to whatever story was circulating. I frowned slightly. What's going on? I murmured to myself. Then I heard it. So Dominic Ashford rejected 3 investors yesterday. Apparently because of that alpha, he's favoring him. My steps slowed for a second. I felt something heavy settle in my chest, so that was the rumor. Apparently Dominic rejecting a few investors during negotiations had somehow turned into a story that he was doing it because of me. Ridiculous. And yet people love drama more than facts. I kept walking, pretending not to notice the stares, but Dominic definitely noticed. He stopped walking. The movement alone was enough to silence the nearby whispers. When Dominic Ashford stopped moving in a room full of businessmen, people paid attention. Slowly, he turned toward a group of investors who had clearly been discussing the rumor. His presence alone made them stiffen. Dominic's voice was calm when he spoke, but it carried across the room effortlessly. If anyone here is concerned about yesterday's negotiations, he said evenly, allow me to clarify something. The room grew quieter. There are over 50 business tycoons attending this summit, he continued. His gaze moved across the room, sharp and unshaken. Rejecting a few proposals is not a crisis. No one spoke. Dominic slipped one hand into his pocket, as if the entire situation bored him. If certain parties are dissatisfied, he added smoothly, they are free to pursue partnerships with the other capable businessmen present. A few investors shifted uncomfortably, and just like that, the tension in the room dissolved. No argument, no confrontation. Just Dominic Ashford stating the obvious truth in a way that made it impossible for anyone to challenge him. Within minutes, conversations resumed like nothing had happened. The rumor died before it even had the chance to grow teeth. I stood there quietly watching him. He hadn't even looked at me while defending me. But somehow, everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. The business trip was supposed to last another day. Just one more day of meetings, dinners, and conferences before I could finally collapse back into my own schedule. But my body refused to cooperate. I was exhausted, my mind buzzing with numbers and negotiations, and a work issue back home demanded my immediate attention. I think I'll head back tonight, I admitted quietly to Dominic as we stepped out of the hotel lobby. He looked at me calm as always, yet there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. I was actually getting ready to leave tonight as well, he said softly. The coincidence felt strange, almost perfect. We walked together through the hotel doors, side by side, and the whispers followed us. People paused mid-step, glancing at the pair of us leaving together. 2 of the most feared and respected businessmen in the room, walking out like we belonged in a different world entirely. When we arrived at the airport, fate seemed to have a sense of humor. Our tickets were for the same flight, and by some unspoken agreement, or maybe just sheer coincidence, we ended up seated next to each other. The plane lifted off, and for a long moment we sat in silence. Finally, I broke it. Tell me about yourself, I said, voice quieter than I expected. Dominic's expression flickered just slightly. I'm not an interesting person, he replied, voice low and calm. You've always been seen as cold, intimidating, and self-centered, he continued. Which is true, I suppose, but I've never really cared what people think. I turned to him, my gaze softening. But among everyone at the conference, I said honestly, it was you who stood out. You're intelligent, strong, calculating, and brilliant in every way. For the first time, A small, almost unguarded light brightened his face. Before I could think, his hand moved slowly, purposefully. He held mine. The warmth of his palm sent a jolt through me, making my chest tighten and my thoughts scramble. Dominic's eyes met mine, calm yet intense. And for the first time, the distance between the Enigma and me vanished. The plane hummed beneath us, the clouds glowing faintly outside the window. But all I could feel was the steady pulse of his hand in mine, and the quiet, undeniable bond that had grown between us over these few days. The wheels of the plane touched down smoothly, and as I stepped into the terminal, I immediately noticed it. A sleek black Rolls-Royce polished to a mirror shine, idling quietly at the curb with the driver standing at attention. Dominic Ashford's car. "Kai," he said, his voice calm, but carrying that unmistakable authority that always made me pay attention. "Get in, I'll drop you off at your doorstep." I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to impose, but the quiet confidence in his eyes made me climb in. The interior smelled faintly of leather, and something uniquely him, calm, warm, and intoxicating all at once. The drive was smooth, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets. We didn't speak much, but I felt comfortable. When we arrived at my building, he stepped out first, opening the door for me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Once inside, he handed me his phone. "Let's exchange contacts," he said simply. I did, still slightly in awe of the fact that the most intimidating man I'd ever met was now offering such an intimate gesture. Over the next few weeks, things changed. Dominic became entangled with me. Not just in business meetings or conference calls, but in small moments I never expected. He helped me sort out projects, accompanied me to important events, and even stayed late when I had to pull an all-nighter. Every time he was there, it felt easy, warm, and romantic in ways I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. Eventually, we became partners. Not just in business, but in everything that mattered. One Friday, I told him I was going to visit my mother over the weekend. He looked at me quietly, then said, "I'll make preparations." I didn't expect much, but when we arrived at my mother's house, Dominic brought out a collection of beautiful gifts, flowers, and delicacies that made my jaw drop. My mother's eyes lit up. "Kai, who is this?" she asked, smiling warmly. "This is Dominic," I said softly. She accepted the gifts graciously. "You've never brought a colleague home before," she said, turning to him. "That means a lot." Dominic smiled faintly. "It's an honor, Mother," he replied. I looked at him dumbfounded. He was so full of surprises. The evening was filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of connection I had only dreamed of. After dinner, something unexpected happened. We ended up in the same bed. The closeness, the warmth, the smell of his cologne, it was overwhelming. Dominic turned to me, his eyes soft, vulnerable even, and whispered, "I care about you, Kai," he whispered. "Me too," I admitted. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, and then the kiss deepened, consuming every ounce of restraint. Just when I thought of the impossible, he marked me. Even after we left my mother's house, the sweetness of our connection didn't fade. Days became weeks, and our bond only grew stronger. Finally, one evening, under the soft glow of city lights, Dominic took my hand, looked into my eyes, and slid a ring onto my finger. "I want us to be together always," he said simply, pressing his lips to mine with a passion that left me breathless. And just like that, the cold, intimidating Enigma, the man who had once terrified me with just a glance, had become my partner, my confidant, and my love. I had never been happier. Thank you for staying till the end. Please like the video, comment, and subscribe for more amazing BL stories. See you next time.